Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today is a big day. It's a big day for me, readers. We are going back to Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. This is a book that I read senior year in high school, and it honestly, I really think it was the beginning of my true interaction with real literature. Until that point, I had been kind of a sporadic reader. I spent one summer when I was 15 reading so much Danielle Steele that at one point I walked into the kitchen of my house and I like conceptualized something in my mind in exactly the language that Danielle Steele was using. And even I, at 15, knew that perhaps I had overdone the Danielle Steele. But I had a teacher in 12th grade who was going to teach us To the Lighthouse, and she told us all about how the rest of the faculty at our high school thought she was crazy because so many people did not think that high school seniors would be able to appreciate Virginia Woolf's genius. So I was very flattered, I think, by the challenge. And then we started reading, and I had this sense that someone had somehow gone inside my brain, that someone, of course, being Virginia Woolf, and had found an ability to articulate exactly how my mind was working. It was a complete revelation. It was such a revelation, in fact, that I bought To the Lighthouse for everyone for Christmas that year because, of course, when I was 17, I couldn't figure out why everyone in my family would not want to, understand completely how my brain was working. I do not think anyone read it, not a single person. Because of that initial impression, but also because of the way that the book has held up every time I have gone back to read it, it is very well established as my favorite book, which is honestly saying a lot. It's like I have Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, and then there's a huge gap, and then there are a bunch of other books that are in contention for my maybe top 5 favorite books. And some of my thinking right now is just the fact that it is almost Memorial Day. I'm recording this on the 20th, I believe, of May, 21st of May, in fact, of 2025. We're almost at Memorial Day, almost at the beginning of the summer. And there is something about To the Lighthouse that really speaks to summer. And although the book is actually set in September, for me, it is something that I tend to come back to in the spring just because I find it so affirmative and so engaging. And for me, at least, it puts you in a very summer kind of mood. I once got in trouble, though, back when we were having these lectures and these meetings in my local bookstore here in Northern California. I somewhat mistakenly, perhaps, advertised To the Lighthouse as the ultimate beach read. I don't think that many people were confused by that because I think Virginia Woolf has enough of a reputation as someone who is really, challenging to read. I don't think anybody was confusing it with that summer's hottest novel. And in many ways, I do stand by it. It is kind of the ultimate beach read. And what we're going to do today is a little bit different. I am looking at today as a kind of introductory lecture for anyone who either has not read To the Lighthouse before, or for anyone who read it a long time ago, or even recently, and wants to reread. So this is kind of an introduction to this novel in particular, but also to Virginia Woolf as a whole, and also certainly to the stream of consciousness mode of writing. So for those of you who like an agenda, we're going to do quite a bit of close reading today, essentially of the first 2 pages of the novel. Before we do that, we are going to talk about the title of the book and the title of the first chapter, The Window. We are going to talk about the importance of this novel as starting en media res, which simply means in the middle of the action. We're going to talk a little bit about domesticity and maternity. We're going to talk about the primacy of sensibility, meaning emotion, meaning sensing things, the primacy of emotion and sensibility over this idea of facts or truths. We're going to talk about the narrative stance, and then we're going to really dive into stream of consciousness, essentially how it is defined, why it is important. We're then going to look, again, very closely at those first 2 pages. And then when we close, I'm going to finish with essentially what is a list of things that you might want to be focusing on as you are reading through this masterpiece. This lecture will be followed by a second lecture where I will sort of parse a lot of that stuff, really dig into a bunch of those things. I'm also in that lecture going to dig into the evocation of summer, which is so interesting to me. It's such a, she does it like no one else. So we're going to take a quick look at that, which actually will just be, joyful. And then we're also going to talk about humor. This time in my reread, for some reason, this book, which is usually not thought of as a humorous book, I found a bunch of instances of humor that really added to my experience this time. Then we're going to talk about Lily Briscoe, and we're going to talk about the structure of the book, a bunch of other things. So if you are someone who wants to use this as an introduction, keep in mind that there will be a second lecture where we will really dig into things. Before we dive in to any of this, I want to give you just a very, very quick bio of Virginia Woolf. I've read many a biography. I will highly recommend the biography by Hermione Lee. It's so good. I mean, it is very, very long, but it is gripping. She was born in 1882. She died in 1941. Famously, she took her own life by filling her pockets with rocks and wading into the river near her house. She was born in this kind of upper middle class family. Her father was very patriarchal and a very large presence in her life. She has said very publicly that To the Lighthouse is very much an exploration of her father. Her family of origin was relatively large. She was one of the younger of the siblings. She was very close with her sister, Vanessa. They were part of the Bloomsbury group, so she grew up as a young child in the Victorian era in this kind of upper middle class family, but then got very bohemian with that group of people who were really testing a lot of the kind of moral strictures of the day. She was not formally educated. She really would have liked to have been formally educated, but she also, there's lots and lots of information about her reading life and her life in general. She kept lots of journals. We have lots and lots of textual evidence for what she was thinking and how she was feeling. But she was very happy in many ways with having read very, very widely and at random. Along with many people in her generation, think of Ezra Pound, think of T.S. Eliot, she was deeply, deeply affected by the First World War. So this is this cataclysmic event that really persuaded her into this thinking that the sort of standard novel, the realist novel, was very hubristic, that this idea of thinking that you could provide the reader with this stable, moralizing, didactic, detailed world, being the realist novel, that mode of writing just wasn't working anymore. It was not a good enough medium in which to talk about the trauma of the war. She was someone who had some pretty profound mental health issues. Her mom died, I think, when she was 13, which just sounds like a terrible, terrible time to have your mom die. I mean, never a good time, but that one seems particularly bad. And there's quite a bit of information about these various sort of breakdowns that she would have. Unfortunately, she was subjected at times to that Victorian rest cure. Not my fantasy of it, which is like a fantasy that you get to claim that you're like hysterical, and then they wheel you out onto a lawn with like a book and some tea in your like white wicker wheelchair kind of situation with a blanket over your lap. That's my fantasy of the Victorian rest cure. The real thing was actually pretty gnarly, because they would deprive you of any kind of stimulation and have you be in a dark room, and thinking that leaving a woman in a dark room with no stimulation and only her mind was a good idea. She was married to Leonard Woolf, but very famously had relationships with other women, Vita Sackville West being one of those women. When she did take her life, it was 1941. She was relatively old. She was in her 60s. I think lots of us think she was much younger because it seems like such a tragic end. I mean, it's still a tragic end, obviously. But you do get the sense that she had lived, a fairly full life in many ways, and certainly had left her mark on literature, but she felt the Second World War coming and just felt that she did not have the strength to live through another cataclysmic European war. Okay, as always, we are going to talk about the title of the book. When you are thinking about sort of reading better, becoming a better reader, first of all, I would encourage you to read with a pencil in hand, always. I write all sorts of stuff all over my books, lots of, stars. There's no rhyme or reason, underlining, stars, circling, hearts, all kinds of different things. I generally don't go back and look at any of this, but I do find when you read with a pencil in hand, you are definitely more engaged with the book. A kind of addendum to that idea of having a pencil is that obviously if you're going to be marking up a book, you need to, in fact, own that book. And here I'm going to put my little plug out. Libraries are amazing. If you are getting your books from the library, excellent. If you are listening to your books on audio, also amazing. But if you are someone who purchases books at your local independent bookstore, I would encourage you to go ahead and spend, the $20 or $30 that it costs to buy a book instead of borrowing it from someone. There is this very large ghost readership that is talked about in the publishing industry. It's especially among women. I like the idea of the economics and sort of the environmental impact of sharing books, but I will say that writers need to be compensated. I'm not sure how we think about that in terms of Virginia Woolf. Maybe it's just fine for you to go ahead. Although we need to also support these publishing houses, certainly. So you should read with a pencil in hand, and you should also simply pay attention. And part of that is paying attention to the title. So this title, To the Lighthouse, is so significant. It's really unusual when you step back and think about it a little bit. We're going to talk in a little bit about some books that we can kind of compare this to, some realist novels and some contemporary novels. Some of them, for example, Anna Karenina, which is, very firmly the name of a woman we are supposed to focus on. The Great Gatsby. We're talking about this kind of mythological American dream figure. We're focusing in both of those cases very clearly on a person. A book like East of Eden, that's a biblical phrase. It's really evocative of something very rich, but it is also, a very specific kind of place, well, a mythological kind of biblical place, but it is something that very firmly stands on its own. In contrast, we have this fragmentary To the Lighthouse. It is a prepositional phrase. It absolutely kind of by definition is a fragment. It's a fragment of something larger. It's not a fragment from the Bible. It's not a fragment from a lot of the romantic poetry that Mr. Ramsay is constantly reciting throughout the book. It is simply a phrase that comes from the novel itself. And not only is it a fragment, but what it is connoting is this idea of movement. It's this idea of trying to get somewhere. It's also the idea of not, in fact, arriving. It is not called The Lighthouse. It is called To the Lighthouse. So you have this idea of things happening, things moving, things not being complete, things being fragmentary, things being unstable. And then, of course, we have the idea of the lighthouse. A lighthouse, very famously and very symbolically is, this tall, actually very phallic thing that stands on rocky shores and that helps bring ships into the harbor. And there is a lighthouse, of course, in the book that features very heavily. And from the very beginning, we have the light of the lighthouse as being extremely important. So it's this idea of illuminating things. It's also this idea of light as being intermittent. We can sort of illuminate things, but we can't see the full picture of them at night. It's this sweeping kind of light that illuminates things just momentarily. And in many ways, this idea of illuminating things and then sort of moving along, you can imagine the progress of that light illuminating things. It is very much like the idea of stream of consciousness, which we will find out is this kind of narrative stance where the narrator and we, the reader, along with the narrator, are moving from sort of consciousness to consciousness, person to person. So you can imagine each of these minds as being illuminated by a beam of light, very much like the lighthouse. Also, from the beginning, we have this idea of the lighthouse and the beam of the lighthouse as being synonymous with Mrs. Ramsay. This is a book that is highly concerned with domesticity and with maternity, and this lighthouse and the light that it is shining is very much symbolic of the idea of a mother as being protective and a mother as being sort of illuminating things in this kind of omnipotent way, but also as being fragile and intermittent and not something that you can count on all the time, especially when the weather gets stormy. So I want to move on now and talk about the chapter titles. So we have 3 sections. The structure of this novel is very important, and the structure was something that Virginia Woolf came up with before she had written the novel. It was something that she conceived at the very beginning, that essentially you would have these 2 big chunks, the beginning chunk and the end chunk, the first one called The Window, and the third one called The Lighthouse. And then there would be a middle section. When she conceived of it, it looked kind of like a barbell. She had like a little drawing with 2 squares at the ends and then kind of a long bar-shaped thing in the middle. That is called Time Passes. So at the beginning, we have the window. Then we have this middle section called Time Passes. And then we have the lighthouse. And again, I would encourage you, if you're trying to be like a better reader, I would encourage you to take a look at these chapter titles. I'm someone, for whatever reason, I just kind of skip right over them. If there are lots of them, I tend to sort of, I don't even know why. Maybe I'm in such a rush to get to the next chunk of prose that I kind of skip right over them. This one, however, is very important. So if we have the idea of the window, we find out fairly soon that what this window is all about is that we have Mrs. Dalloway, not Mrs. Dalloway. We have Mrs. Ramsay sitting with her youngest son and her favorite, young James, who's maybe like 6 or 7. And they're sitting inside this window, and across from them, out in the yard, nearby-ish, is Lily Briscoe. Lily Briscoe is a painter who is largely read as a stand-in for Virginia Woolf. Whenever you're reading fiction, if there is a character in the book who's like a musician or an artist or an architect, you can often just read that person as essentially a stand-in for the writer. These are people who build things. These are people who create creative things. And sometimes it can feel heavy-handed. But in this case, it is so important and so well done to look very closely at Lily Briscoe as a stand-in for Virginia Woolf in particular. So we have Lily Briscoe, and she is painting Mrs. Ramsay and James. One thing that's important to note here, when they're talking about the window in this case, it's like a French window, which it took me a while to figure that out. It's not like a plate glass window. We don't have glass here. And the reason you know that is because occasionally the people on the porch will stop in front of this window and have conversations with Mrs. Ramsay. We also know that Lily Briscoe can see, James very clearly. So you have to, this window is like a French door, we would say, in the United States. So it's open. So you have even more kind of intercourse between the public and the private, even more fluidity, and even more is revealed, but you still have that idea of the two things being separate. So the reason why the window is important, first of all, we have this frame, and it is framing this very domestic, very maternal scene. It's very important, though, that James and Mrs. Ramsay are inside. They are indoors. They are very firmly inside the domestic sphere. Lily Briscoe is outside the domestic sphere. She's on the other side of the window. We have this idea of separation, that things are separate, that people are separate from one another. But also this idea that what Virginia Woolf is doing is making that separation between people into something that is transparent. Lily, to a large extent, is able to sort of see the importance of Mrs. Ramsay as a mother and in communion with James. We have this idea of, like, it's not quite voyeurism, but we have this idea of looking into other people's lives. And not only that, but looking into their private domestic lives. And stream of consciousness, if it does nothing else, it really does allow us to look into people's private lives. On that note, there's also this idea of looking into the window. It's like a window into someone's life. So metaphorically, the idea of the window, we have these windows open into these people's lives. And the last thing I will say about the idea of the window is that this present moment that we are introduced to at the beginning, when Mrs. Ramsay is sitting with James, and we soon find out that Lily Briscoe is painting them, this idea of the window is really helping us to focus on this present moment, because the present moment, through the vast majority of the first chapter called The Window, is this kind of moment to which we return. So when we talk of stream of consciousness, we're going to cover this, but we have this moment of Mrs. Ramsay and James, and we digress from that moment. We talk about Minta Doyle and Paul, and we talk about Mr. Carmichael, and we talk about William Banks and Lily Briscoe, and we talk about Mr. Ramsay, who is often kind of interrupting this present moment. And we move from, the mind of Mrs. Ramsay into many of these different characters. And when I say we move into them, it's a third-person narrator. We're not, no one is saying, I think this and I think that, or I feel this or I feel that. But instead, we have this very nimble third-person narrator who is dipping into the thoughts and emotions and sensibility and feelings of many of these different characters. But the idea of the window is important as a frame while also anchoring us in this present moment. So this idea of interiority is really important. And this, I want to take a quick step back here, or maybe like a widening here of the lecture. So we have looked recently at a bunch of different realist novels. Anna Karenina, way back in the early days of the Foxed Page, we looked at Madame Bovary, which is kind of the first big realist novel. We looked at East of Eden. We've looked at a lot of novels that are in the realist tradition. And in that tradition, the author is essentially trying to give us an entire world. And the way that they are doing that is by supplying a lot of details, but for the most part, they are staying out of the minds of the characters. So they are describing things sort of from afar. And we have this narrator who almost feels like a spectator or a voyeur, where we have this idea of someone who is this authoritative, omniscient, omnipotent force who is shaping the story and deciding which parts to tell and deciding which details to include. But the idea is that we were going to have this world that you could step into and essentially feel what that world felt like. This was, the second half of the 19th century. And interestingly, toward the end of the 19th century, you have something called naturalism. So you think of Émile Zola, who wrote L'Assommoir, and he wrote a bunch of different things where he was taking realism and pushing it a little further, making it political. So he would take, this idea of this very real, very inhabitable, very believable world, and then he would put this like giant political spin on it because he would be talking about the horrible working conditions of the working class in France. So the reason why I mention that is because the realist novel and the naturalist novel certainly, purport to provide the reader this kind of true environment, and with it comes a lot of political weight and a lot of moral weight. I mean, these are books that really come down one way or another. Anna Karenina is definitely kind of an well, depending on how you read it, you can go back and listen to that lecture. For the most part, it feels like an anti-adultery kind of novel. We have lots and lots of, certainly Madame Bovary is that, we have lots and lots of moralizing that comes with those. So this idea of kind of like a capital T truth that is promoted by the realist and naturalist novel is completely upended with Virginia Woolf. So we talked about the effect of the First World War, but also I think it's important to think of her as a woman who is outside academia, who was not educated the way her brothers were, who is someone who had a lot of independence and a lot of drive and a lot of ambition, and who was very, very bright, but who definitely felt herself outside of things. She also was someone who was, brought up during the Victorian era, 1882, the Victorian era being sort of 1850 to 1900. So that is an era when men were seen as incredibly authoritative and women were seen as kind of frail and retiring. So this idea of kind of like this masculine, omnipotent, omniscient narrator who can put forth this capital T truth was something that just wasn't resonating with Virginia Woolf. So instead of this objectivity, supposed objectivity of the realist novel and this omniscient narrator, what she is doing is putting forth this radical idea of subjectivity. So what we see with all of this interiority into the Lighthouse and all of her work is this idea of truth as being something, it's like a lowercase t truth, in the sense that many different people have their own versions of the truth. We see a bunch of kind of overlapping action, which is so interesting. We'll see the same event from different people's points of view, and it will take on radically different truth in each one of these people's perspectives. It is so fascinating. So instead of this kind of hubristic idea that we could provide the reader this like morally rigid, didactic, true feeling world, what she's doing is putting forth this idea that nobody really has that idea of capital T truth. No one should be putting forth an idea of this objective sense of the world, because in fact, everyone's own perspective on the world is subjective. And that subjectivity, of course, allows for an enormous amount of empathy. When I think of empathy in Virginia Woolf, I go sort of automatically to Septimus Warren Smith, who is a character in Mrs. Dalloway. He is a soldier from the First World War who is experiencing very intense PTSD. And that is in some ways one of her most radical experiments in helping the reader understand what a character is going through. We don't, though, have to go back to him to find, characters worthy of extreme empathy. As I was reading, just finishing up this morning, I really was struck by the way that you can empathize with all of these people. I mean, we think of Mr. Dalloway. We think of Mr. Ramsay as someone who is this kind of brash and somewhat unlikable male authority figure, but there are lots of ways that we are made to empathize, that we are made to really understand. And I don't even mean sympathize. I mean that we are inside, the thoughts and feelings of these different people. We don't spend a lot of time, and this is significant because I think Virginia Woolf was not, her aim here was not to step inside the idea of, the mind of the patriarch. It was very much more to illuminate everyone else. So we really do see Mr. Ramsay mostly from the outside. But you find yourself empathizing with everyone in the book in a way that is really innovative and just sort of radical. Just before we dive into our very close reading of the first two pages 3 and 4 in my volume, I want to just give you a quick sense of some of the hallmarks of the stream of consciousness writing. So usually it is this third-person narrator. It's not first person. We're not inside the minds of these people saying, I did this and I think that. We have this third-person narrator who is, a lot of it is called free indirect discourse, where you have that narrator moving in and out of the minds of different people, but maintaining some kind of objectivity and some sort of distance from it all. Very famously, there are lots of run-on sentences in stream of consciousness, which makes sense. I think you can tell from the term itself that what we are talking about is the way that consciousness works. And of course, one of the ways that it does is that our thoughts, over which we have very little control, each thought is sort of succeeded by another. And there are not kind of tidy finishes to one thought and the next. So you have this idea of these run-on sentences. In Woolf, we have a lot of unorthodox punctuation, which of course I love. This is one of those examples of like, you have to know your punctuation and your grammar in order to go ahead and violate all of the rules. Because when she is violating, quote unquote, these rules, what she's really doing is making grammar work in some very unusual ways. I love her use of parentheses. We're going to take a look at that. There is a quality of musicality with stream of consciousness. So we have a little bit of this kind of verse and refrain. You also, of course, have the musicality of the prose itself. I mean, if you think of Proust, you think of In Search of Lost Time. There is a lyrical quality, a musical quality to each sentence itself. But what I note mostly into The Lighthouse is sort of structurally that we have these moments that often will be a phrase that she will repeat verbatim, that sometimes are signaling, that we are in a present moment or we are returning to a present moment after a digression. But sometimes it's simply for emphasis. Sometimes it's to signal the end of a thought as we are moving on to another thought. So there's a fair amount of repetition. And with this repetition, we have this beautiful weaving together. So you may have a repetition of something, 2 or 3 pages later that's sort of woven into the next thought. But it is this kind of highly unusual and really beautiful way to present, the subjective experience of someone's mind. One of the aspects that was most shocking for me back in high school is this idea of mimesis. So mimesis or mimetic, if something is mimetic, it is basically mimicking reality. So the best example in this book is that occasionally things will happen, and often they're in parentheses, that will be very shocking to the reader. They will be just suddenly presented inside a parentheses and coming seemingly out of nowhere. And as the reader, you are shook. And the beautiful thing about that, and it illustrates mimesis very nicely, is that when these things are happening, when they are presented that way, the reason she's doing that is because the characters are also absolutely surprised, just sort of startled and astonished by this thing that is suddenly occurring. So surprise in mimesis is kind of the main thing that she does, but there are other ways that if a time is very soothing or if a time is very complicated, a lot of the language will reflect that so that the reader is essentially feeling the same thing that the characters are feeling. So before we dive into our close reading of the first couple of pages of To the Lighthouse, I want to read a couple of opening sentences of other works, just so you have some points of comparison to understand the radical nature of what she is doing. So for example, we have George Eliot, we have Middlemarch. It begins this way. Miss Brooks had that kind of beauty which seems to be thrown into relief by poor dress. It's an awesome opening sentence. It's very good. But you have this sense of this narrator who is pulled back. And this narrator actually has kind of a sassy personality thing happening here, which is really to her credit, this idea of the narrator as feeling like it is almost a character in the book, but certainly at a distance and describing the exteriority of Miss Brooke. What we see throughout the book are things that can be described from the outside. So I'm giving you kind of a wide smattering here. Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. In the year 1878, I took my degree of Doctor of Medicine of the University of London and proceeded to Netley to go through the course prescribed for surgeons in the army. So here we have a first-person narrator, but it still is very kind of, it's providing these facts. This is getting at some sort of true events that occurred that Arthur Conan Doyle is going to kind of line up for us in what ends up being a delightful way, but it's very different than the interiority that we are about to see. This is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. The Salinas Valley is in Northern California. I mean, that's the first sentence right there. I'm going to read the first little paragraph. The Salinas Valley is in Northern California. It is a long, narrow swale between 2 ridges of mountains, and the Salinas River winds and twists up the center until it falls at last into Monterey Bay. So this is that archetypal omniscient narrator. It's starting from very, very far away. It's, again, sort of biblical in the sense that it is, having, it's not exactly hubris, but just the scope to think that you can add the authority of the land, of the state of California, of this fertile valley. You can kind of claim it as an aspect of your novel. This is from The Great Gatsby. It came out the same year as Mrs. Dalloway, 1925, so 2 years before To the Lighthouse. The Great Gatsby is kind of a bridge to modernism. It is that book, man, I mean, wow, talk about an amazing book to revisit that we all read back in the day. There are some aspects of modernist writing, and modernist writing is the category in which we see stream of consciousness. It's kind of 1910 to 1940-ish, where you have a lot of experimentation, a lot of formal experimentation by writers like Virginia Woolf, certainly, but also James Joyce. We have Faulkner in the United States. And Fitzgerald is mostly put into kind of this late realist camp, but there are lots of modernist elements. But still, we have a fairly kind of standard beginning to the novel. We have this. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice which has been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing someone, he said, just remember that all people in this world haven't had the same advantages as you have. So we do have a first-person narrator, but we have this kind of wider scope. He's talking kind of objectively about this piece of advice that he got from his father. It's very sort of patriarchal, the opening of this whole thing. And in some ways very kind of theoretical and broad, this idea of, long ago I received a piece of advice. It is not speaking to the specificity of a given moment of experience in consciousness. Okay, with all of that supporting information, we are going to dive into the novel. And as I am reading this very first part, keep in mind those other openings to those other famous novels, just to experience the difference here. So this chapter is called The Window. It begins like this. Yes, of course, if it's fine tomorrow, said Mrs. Ramsay, but you'll have to be up with the lark, she added. So this is absolutely crucial. What we are having here in the beginning is we are beginning en media res. So that's a Latin phrase simply meaning in the middle of something. We are beginning in the middle of a conversation that Mrs. Ramsay is having with her son. We don't actually know to whom she is saying this, but it is fragmentary enough. It's obviously a rejoinder. So we know that she is in conversation with someone. So a few things that are really remarkable. Beside the fact that we're diving into something, we're not sort of setting the scene. We're in fact we're opening by being right in the middle of the scene. It's also very important that we are hearing Mrs. Ramsay's voice. Hers is the voice that opens the entire thing. We are hearing a woman speaking, and that is not true of any of the other narrators that we were talking about. Even when George Eliot is talking about Miss Brooke, and we have that kind of sassy narrator, you don't get the sense necessarily that we are hearing a woman's voice. It's also important here that we have this affirmative thing at the beginning. Yes, of course, if it's fine tomorrow. So Mrs. Ramsay, again, if we think of her as the ray of the lighthouse, she is very positive in many ways for everyone around her. She is someone inside who is not feeling perhaps as positive as the vibes that she's giving to her family. But in many ways, her role, as is the role of a lot of women, and certainly those in the Victorian era, is to be very positive and to buoy people. No pun intended. So we have that opening sentence, we have her quoted, we hear her voice, and then we have this. To her son, these words conveyed an extraordinary joy, as if it were settled, the expedition were bound to take place, and the wonder to which he had looked forward for years and years, it seemed, was, after a night's darkness and a day's sail, within touch. Oh my gosh, it's so good. It's so moving already. I'm feeling so moved. So we have this statement by her, and then immediately to her son. So we are entering with that kind of economy and that kind of straightforward statement. We are moving into the mind of her son, James. And right after to her son, we have this emphasis on words. These words conveyed an extraordinary joy. So here we have this emphasis on emotion. We are not talking about advice that someone got from their father. We are talking about this sensation of joy. Not only that, it is extraordinary joy. And the important thing right from the start here is that it is words that are conveying this extraordinary joy. In many ways, this is a study. This entire novel is a study of subtlety, which is one of the many reasons it resonated with me so clearly. We're going to read a little part where Mrs. Ramsay talks about her antennae as being very attuned to what is going on around her. A simple glance from her husband, a tone of voice, something she hears in the other room, all of those are things that completely alter her state. And importantly, we are seeing this happening right here. She simply says something, and to her son, this extraordinary joy is arising from her words. We then have all of these different clauses that we have that are all separated by commas. We have lots and lots of commas. I mean, this is not technically a run-on sentence. Grammatically, it works. We could diagram it. I loved diagramming sentences back in the day. That is something, it's a lost art, frankly. But we have all of these different phrases that immediately are sort of putting us into the mind of the child. So let's reread that quickly. To her son, these words conveyed an extraordinary joy, as if it were settled, the expedition were bound to take place, and the wonder to which he had looked forward for years and years, it seemed, was, after a night's darkness and a day's sail, within touch. So, very significantly, the sentence ends with touch. You have this idea of senses as being very alert and being very important. They're given primacy here. And we also are introducing at the beginning this idea of the trip to the lighthouse. So this fragmentary title of the novel, To the Lighthouse, right here, this idea of this expedition has been introduced. And then moving on. Since he belonged, even at the age of 6, to that great... He's 6. Earlier, I think I said 7. Since he belonged, even at the age of 6, to that great clan which cannot keep this feeling separate from that, but must let future prospects, with their joys and sorrows, cloud what is actually at hand, since to such people, even in earliest childhood, any turn in the wheel of sensation has the power to crystallize and transfix the moment upon which its gloom or radiance rests. What an absolute privilege it is to parse this language. So we have this idea of this great clan. This is this kind of infusion of kind of a male aspect. I mean, the idea of belonging to this great clan and thinking about it, I mean, it brings you right back to, like the Scottish clans and, ancient England and Scotland. So you have this evocation with this very small word of this kind of capital H history, which is in line with the kind of ways that James might be thinking about things. But we also know, because she's telling us very clearly, that he feels things very deeply. One thing that's very important, when she says here, to the great clan which cannot keep this feeling separate from that. So the idea of this feeling, it seems very subtle, but it's very important because this feeling is immediate. It's not that he can't keep, that emotion separate from the other. It's this emotion. It's a very, it makes things feel very immediate in this very subtle way. It's also very important and compelling here that we have these extremes. Not only is the narrator telling us that he feels these extremes, but we have joys and sorrow, gloom and radiance. And all of the characters in the book, the ones that we're focusing on, do feel things in extreme ways. Again, this is a real study of subtlety, but this idea of emotions as being extreme is kind of a radical proposition. Even the characters, Charles Tansley, who is the young academic who is there, who has a real chip on his shoulder, or Augustus Carmichael, or William Banks. These are characters who are, relatively composed. Charles Tansley's not so composed, but the other two are these composed men, and yet they are also feeling, these extremes of emotion, which is really part of the innovative nature of this novel, that not only is it talking about emotions, but it is making them very dramatic, and I think very compelling and exciting. So then we're moving on. James Ramsay, sitting on the floor cutting out pictures from the illustrated catalog of the Army and Navy stores, endowed the picture of a refrigerator, as his mother spoke, with heavenly bliss. So here we have this really beautiful thing where we're beginning with James Ramsay. We're talking here about the clan. We're bringing in the last name. The idea of Ramsay, we have the force of a ram, but we also have Ramses, those Egyptian, kings. I think that's a thing. I think King Ramses, I think that's some sort of Egyptian potentate. So we have this kind of grandeur, James Ramsay, and we're kind of pulling back a little bit. But then we have him sitting on the floor with his mother. So we are going from this very kind of more formal address into a very domestic setting. And then the Army and Navy stores catalog, nothing in Woolf, not one single word is random. The idea of the Army and Navy is really important if you are keeping in mind that this novel is in large part, in conversation with the horrors of the First World War. This emphasis right at the beginning of this military presence in the domestic sphere is subtle, but it is extremely important. We see it again and again. Pretty soon, we're introduced to one of the little boys who's going around shooting at things. We have guns. We have things that sound like explosions. The presence of the war is very palpable, if very subtle. So we also have this idea of him cutting out a refrigerator and then endowing it with heavenly bliss. So this is this idea, again, of domesticity, but enormous emotion being sort of part and parcel with the domestic sphere. So not only did he endow it with heavenly bliss, but the next sentence says, it was fringed with joy. So here we're seeing this repetition. That is the third time we've seen the word joy. Extraordinary joy in the beginning, joys and sorrows in the middle of the paragraph, and then down here, it was fringed with joy. And importantly, fringed with joy is a very unusual sort of image. And this is another thing that Woolf is so good at, and all of the modernists. The idea of a refrigerator being fringed with joy is unusual. It's very evocative. And I think you get a sense of it. You can kind of imagine how he would see it, but it is not conventional. Then moving along, we're going to move a little bit further now from the domestic sphere. The wheelbarrow, the lawn mower, the sound of poplar trees, leaves whitening before rain, rooks cawing, brooms knocking, dresses rustling, all these were so colored and distinguished in his mind that he had already his private code, his secret language, though he appeared the image of stark and uncompromising severity, with his high forehead and his fierce blue eyes, impeccably candid and pure, frowning slightly at the sight of human frailty, so that his mother, watching him guide his scissors neatly around the refrigerator, imagined him all red and ermine on the bench, or directing a stern and momentous enterprise in some crisis of public affairs. We're not going to parse this all the way through, but one thing to note here is the idea that things look very calm, the surface of everything in this novel appears one way, but what is happening beneath is anything but calm. And as I mentioned, we are moving away from the domestic sphere. As soon as we're talking about the mower and the poplar trees and the leaves whitening in before the rain, all of that is moving us out through the window and into this world. It's really beautiful, though, the way we have the refrigerator and then the mower as being, sort of another domestic-ish tool is providing a kind of bridge. So we're moving from the private sphere out into the nature, into the afternoon/evening. And as we move there, we're having a kind of a more masculine emphasis here. So we have stark and uncompromising severity with his high forehead and his fierce blue eyes, and then frowning slightly at the sight of human frailty. And the end of the paragraph where his mother is imagining him on the bench or being very stern in this public sphere, I mean, she goes so far as to imagine him in red and ermine, which is, obviously like a very royal kind of thing. I think when she's talking about the bench or a crisis in public affairs, that's kind of more like something in the House of Parliament. He's not going to be dressed up in red and ermine. To her, all of those sorts of signs of authority are all kind of mixed together. And what's fascinating is we're moving from this mother-child scene out into a more male world, and then we have this. But, said his father, stopping in front of the drawing room window, it won't be fine. So significantly and notably here, the voice of authority of the father comes in, and this is a very negative thing, and it stands in direct contrast to the positivity of Mrs. Ramsay that we hear in the opening line. So again, we have this. But, said his father, stopping in front of the drawing room window, it won't be fine. It's also important to note that he is responding to what Mrs. Ramsay has said. So this is that idea of there being this kind of present moment. It's the moment when she's having this conversation with James, and we are returning. We've had this digression about James and his, what he's doing with his fringed joy refrigerator, and then also, a movement into his future. And then suddenly we are brought back right away, almost instantaneously, to the present moment where Mr. Ramsay is opposing what his wife has just said. And importantly, we are still very much in James's perspective, although that's not clear right away, but it becomes very clear soon. So we have his father saying, it won't be fine. Had there been an axe handy or a poker, Any weapon that would have gashed a hole in his father's breast and killed him there and then, James would have seized it. Such were the extremes of emotion that Mr. Ramsay excited in his children's breast by his mere presence. Standing, as now, lean as a knife, narrow as the blade of one, grinning sarcastically, not only with the pleasure of disillusioning his son and casting ridicule upon his wife, who was 10,000 times better in every way than he was, James thought. So importantly, that little James thought is in parentheses there. So Woolf is kindly reminding us, I'm not even sure we need it. It's kind of like a nice point of emphasis here that we are still very much in the... And then we do this fascinating thing where we are moving right after this parenthetical where it says James thought. We're moving toward Mr. Ramsay. So we're moving toward a description of him. And at first it's kind of an exterior description, but then we are moving in more into his interior. So we have his wife, who was 10,000 times better in every way than he was, James thought, but also with some secret conceit at his own accuracy of judgment. What he said was true. It was always true. He was incapable of untruth, never tampered with a fact, never altered a disagreeable word to suit the pleasure or convenience of any mortal being, least of all his own children, who, sprung from his loins, should be aware from childhood that life is difficult. So here we are very firmly kind of in the things that he might say. You could also argue that James is kind of articulating the way that he sees his father. And if you're reading it that way, it's James, being sort of angrily just like saying that his father wields the truth and facts in ways that are painful. They should be aware from childhood that life is difficult, facts uncompromising. And the passage to that fabled land where our brightest hopes are extinguished, our frail barks founder in darkness. Here Mr. Ramsay would straighten his back and narrow his little blue eyes upon the horizon, one that needs, after all, courage, truth, and the power to endure. So it's even, I think probably as a listener here, it's a little confusing to follow all of this. But what he's talking about is this fabled land, of adulthood, that you sort of have these visions of yourself. And we just above have this vision of what Mrs. Ramsay hopes that James might develop into. But then we have this very dour, very pessimistic view that is put forth by Mr. Ramsay about how life is difficult. So what's important here at the bottom of this paragraph very early in the book is all of this emphasis on facts and truth. And there's all sorts of repetition, just like we had repetition of joy before when we were talking about James. Now we are having this repetition of true and truth and fact and facts to really give us this sense of who Mr. Ramsay is and what his emphasis, what his sort of orientation is all about. So you might have noted in my voice, there's another parenthetical phrase. We are sort of in his mind where he's thinking about the frail barks foundering in darkness. Then we have parentheses. Here Mr. Ramsay would straighten his back and narrow his little blue eyes upon the horizon. Importantly, he's looking toward the horizon. Everyone in some ways is kind of focused on the lighthouse, is focused outward, and not just, into the lawn and where the other people are, but beyond that. So we have Mr. Ramsay looking toward the horizon. We have James hoping to get to the lighthouse. We have Mrs. Ramsay, who is acutely aware of everything that is going on around her. But she is the one who first introduces, who first sees the lighthouse. And she's obviously thinking about whether or not James will get to go the next day. And she's thinking about the weather. So all of them, while they are very firmly in this domestic sphere, he's on the porch, they're inside the house, they're all focused on the horizon. And then this last sentence we're going to read here. But it may be fine. I expect it will be fine, said Mrs. Ramsay, making some little twist of the reddish-brown stocking she was knitting impatiently. So here we have ourselves returning with her positivity, but also firmly to the domestic sphere, because here we have this inclusion of knitting, which is obviously a very domestic task. So these first two pages, it's just fascinating what she is doing already. And all of this emphasis on interiority and on feelings and some of this repetition and the way we are returning to the first moment, these are things that we see throughout the entire novel. And they're expanded in many ways, but we have this blueprint, this innovative and very different way that she is operating right from the start. So before we close, I want to just look at a couple of different things. So again, I put some emphasis on the parentheses. If you plan to go back and read, pay attention to some of the parentheses. Sometimes she'll open a parentheses, and then 3 pages later, you will have the close of the parentheses. And in some ways, I love how inconsistent she is with that. So she has all these different tools that she will use to sort of help the reader understand that this is a digression or this is someone else's thought. But there's so much variety, which I think is really excellent because it speaks to kind of, the variety with which everyone's individual brain is functioning. So I want to move on now just to look at these 2 instances where I felt like Virginia Woolf is really articulating exactly the way that my brain functions. And I think this is worth looking at, not just, in some self-indulgent way, but because this is the kind of interiority, this is the kind of stream of consciousness stuff, the innovative intimacy and the emphasis on feeling and interiority that is so strong in this novel. So we look at page 61. This is when she's reading a story about the fisherman and his wife, which, of course, Woolf is really using this to her advantage in many ways. The fable of the fisherman and his wife, which she is reading, has everything to do with her relationship with her husband. It has to do with the ocean. It has to do with the lighthouse, the setting. But this is a story that she is reading to young James. She turned the page. There were only a few lines more so that she would finish the story, though it was past bedtime. It was getting late. The light in the garden told her that. And the whitening of the flowers and something gray in the leaves conspired together to rouse in her a feeling of anxiety. What it was about she could not think at first. Then she remembered. Paul and Minta and Andrew had not come back. So what we have here is this description of what is happening, and then we have this very strong emotion that it is evoking, and then we have kind of a process of the mind, and I think many of you have experienced that, where you have kind of a stab of anxiety or sorrow or concern or whatever the thing is, and you're like, wait, what is it? Why do I feel like this? What is it that is bringing up this emotion? Then she has this very neat colon, and she has the brief and economic and distinct description of what it was, that one of her sons and her guests have not yet returned. There's one more example I want to read again of how my mind functions, and I think how many people's minds function. We have moved at this point in the novel. We are now on page 107, so we're almost halfway through. We are no longer with the present moment of Mrs. Ramsay and James. We've moved into the dining room a little bit later where everyone is assembling for dinner. And this is very much in Mrs. Ramsay's point of view, and she's experiencing the conversation. She would be saying she liked the Waverley novels or had not read them. She would be urging herself forward. Now she said nothing. For a moment she hung suspended. "Ah, but how long do you think it'll last?" said somebody. It was as if she had antennae trembling out from her which, intercepting certain sentences, forced them upon her attention. This was one of them. She scented danger for her husband. A question like that would lead, almost certainly, to something being said which reminded him of his own failure. How long would he be read, he would think at once. William Banks, who was entirely free of all such vanity, laughed and said he attached no importance to changes in fashion. Who could tell what was going to last, in literature or indeed in anything else? So this is not only a beautiful articulation of how my brain works, this idea of these antennae and sensing some sort of danger and then trying to figure out how you might, in fact, solace the people around you. But she's also talking about something very important here, this question of what will last. And not only what will last, but in this specific case, she's talking about literature. It's very meta in some ways. And honestly, that's a great note to end on because this is a novel that has lasted. I mean, we are coming up on the 100th anniversary of To the Lighthouse. It's crazy to think that this is the anniversary. We just celebrated Gatsby, but this is also the anniversary of Mrs. Dalloway. I don't know why more is not being made of that. Perhaps it's coming in the fall. But this idea of lasting literature is so significant. And one of the reasons why this novel does last is because it was so innovative. And this is an excellent point at which to ask, so what? What is it about this that's innovative? I mean, just with something being innovative, you could move right beyond it and have it not be very resonant anymore in the present day. But this is extremely resonant, I think, because Virginia Woolf is moving us from this kind of vision that is from the outside of the world and moving us into a description of what is happening on the level of thoughts, but also of feelings. It's really a radical change and really the reason I think why the novel endures. So thank you so much for tuning in. Get out there and read some more Cormac McCarthy straight away. Happy reading.